Growing plants in containers has been practiced for generations. An important objective is to grow under protection plants which are unsuited to the natural climate. Another is to produce flowers or fruits out of season. Also to have the opportunity to arrange plants attractively and imaginatively in decorative settings. Containers offer original and often unusual opportunities for garden decoration outdoors. This video aims to show opportunities and stimulate ideas for improving the garden, especially in small or restricted spaces, and conservatory and home decoration by the use of containers. All sorts have been used through the ages, but the most common would be the clay pot, overtaken in recent years by its plastic relative.
Growing plants in containers is deservedly popular. It's often a very easy way, particularly with flowering plants, to provide instant impact and an extremely good display. It gives you a chance too to have flights of fancy with regard to artistic arrangement. Particularly so as there is a very, very wide range of containers and an even wider range of plants to choose from.
Containers may be situated in walled gardens, which can be transformed into a blaze of colour and may be used to enhance conservatories and entrances. Placed on patios and steps, they may take the form of conventional containers or even novelties. There is really no limit to the opportunities and ingenuity which container gardening allows. They may be wall-mounted or floor-standing. It's even possible to grow very useful crops of vegetables and some fruits in containers. Gardeners aspire to magnificent displays such as these, but among the hidden considerations is the often neglected but paramount one of safety. Installing window boxes, hanging baskets or wall-mounted pots invites dangers from them being dislodged, and similarly there is a risk from some very large stone-cast containers becoming top-heavy, with a risk of danger to adventurous climbing children. No container venture should be embarked upon without bearing these challenges in mind, and that attended to container gardening can be an exciting and fulfilling adventure. Whether the gardener is attracted to pots, baskets, tubs or window boxes, there are several basic considerations to remember. Almost all of the plant candidates will have their roots restricted and be expected to grow in what is an unnatural situation. So for success, the container gardener must be prepared to give regular attention to thorough watering and feeding and to general maintenance of the plants. The rewards of such care can be truly magnificent. The penalty for neglect can spoil the visual aspect of the garden, conservatory, patio, or even the whole property. Through all of these opportunities, there remains the long-established flower pot for growing flowering and foliage plants indoors or in greenhouses. Hanging baskets are a long-established means of decorating the outside of a building or indeed extending the decoration within a greenhouse or conservatory. There are very many types and designs to choose from at the garden centre.
Of all containers, certainly over recent years, the hanging basket has without doubt become the most popular. It certainly gives immediate impact, nice bit of colour at a strategic position. There are many kinds, of course. We get plastic covered wire baskets. Unfortunately, some are in this rather lurid colour, but this does have an advantage. It has a flat bottom, and that's quite useful when you're making up the basket, say, on a greenhouse bench. Another wire one here. Disadvantage with this one, the holes are very small, and this makes for great difficulty when one's planting in the sides. Traditionally, of course, straight galvanised wire basket, spirally arranged. This is quite useful because when we plant in the side, we can so easily part the strands of wire. Here's one which I rather like, and the one in fact I'm going to use in a second or two. Plastic coated, dullish green, fairly good holes for planting in the side. But we mustn't forget that there are hanging pots made from plastic usually, although there are some made from terracotta, and indeed one can get wooden baskets. But the advantage with these hanging pots is that they do have a little reservoir either attached to the bottom or sometimes inserted inside. But of course, with the basket as we see it, we've got to be able to hold the compost inside, and that means to say we've got to look at some sort of linings, of which again there are many sorts. The solid ones made from compressed fibre. We have various forms of sheeting, plastic sheeting or just lightly woven netting, sacking even. Certainly some nice ones made from coconut fibre. Foam plastic can be used, impregnated cardboard, and more recently some wool waste material, which I find particularly nice to handle and looks good too. But there's still a lot to be said for moss. It handles nicely, it certainly looks well, and moulds in to the shape of the basket. But there is an important conservation consideration, and all I can say is that when you're raking the moss out of your lawn in the spring, that can certainly be used for a very, very effective lining. But there we are. I've filled up about a third of the basket, and I'm going to place a disc of plastic just into the bottom, and that will help to hold moisture in at the base. Now for the first filling. And I'm using soilless compost because it's much, much lighter, and that quite clearly is important for something that is going to be hanging on the end of a bracket. Slight consolidation, and we're ready to put the first plant in through the side. And I'm using some trailing lobelia, which is still a very popular plant, bearing in mind that there's a wide range of plants available from garden centres and nurserymen. And you will notice that these are coming in what we call plugs, and they're ideal for planting through the sides. I've put about 4 trailing lobelia in the side. Do remember that it's important to put plenty of plants in, and here we go now with some trailing petunia. Now some people in fact include polymer granules which have the capacity to expand with water to many times their original volume, and in turn this water is then let out into the compost to be taken up by the plant. Having said that, I do know that some folk have found indifferent results, but they're certainly worth a try. Another layer of moss all the way round. There is another technique, of course, with regard to filling, and that is to fill the whole of the basket with moss and just plant through the sides with the moss in situ, but I still think there's a lot to be said for doing it in layers, as we're doing here, making sure that there's a fair amount on the outside, and then we're ready for more compost. Slight consolidation, and we're going to plant again another row. Now here's a plant with a very, very strong root system. Now don't be frightened to be fairly brutal. You can tear quite a little bit of the root away, and you'll find that you can maneuver it through the side in that way. That plant, incidentally, has become extremely popular. It's a plant called Scaevola Blue Wonder, and it flowers and flowers all through the summer. And here's another newer plant. It's sold as Bacopa Snowflake, but its proper name is Sutura cordata, but it's a jolly good white, really an ever-flowering subject. Now you can see that it's becoming perhaps quite congested, but don't worry about that, because it's important to have a good mass planting. And here's another little trick. We can knock the plant out, especially if it's one with lots of foliage. We roll it up in the paper, and by so doing it's relatively easy to feed that top through the gap in the wire without doing real damage to the plant. And there we are. We carry on round the top. Don't be frightened to not exactly ill-treat the root system, but don't be frightened to squeeze it. And so another layer of plants all the way round, and then we put more moss on the top, making sure that we have a nice firm rim. And the other thing, of course, that it will need is regular feeding. And regular feeding can in fact mean that we're using a dilute feed every time we water. So there are three watchwords really: plant generously, water generously, and feed generously. And if you do those three things, you're sure of success. Now I've put the top layer on now, making a good firm rim, notice above the top wire of the basket, so that that will in turn retain as much water as possible when we carry out our regular waterings, making a slight hollow in the middle, which in turn will help hold just that little bit of extra moisture. Just for a final consolidation to make sure that the plants are well firmed in, I've put the chain on, and there we are, ready for hanging up. Of course, a hanging basket can be used for certainly spring flowering plants, and don't forget too that there are many, many subjects that are suitable for hanging baskets that can be used in the conservatory and the greenhouse.
There are many combinations of flowering and foliage plants which can be put together for attractive display. Windowsills and steps not in regular use can be greatly enlivened by plants growing in window boxes and troughs. It's possible to buy ready-made units, but it will often be more suitable to make a unit to fit a given situation. Do ensure that the box or trough unit has drainage holes made in it, and give a special thought as to how the water will drain away. Fixing window boxes, especially where they're above patios or footpaths, must be done with the greatest possible care, so that they're secure always. The wide range of bedding plants suitable for hanging or other baskets will also give a good display in boxes and troughs, where training plants are especially valuable in masking the container. But it's also possible in certain situations to have climbing plants growing in boxes and troughs, and this is quite easily done by fixing an upright structure of cane or wall-fixed wires or netting, so that climbers or scramblers can be used to cover a wall space and give more interest in the vertical dimension.
Window boxes, and we often think of them just in terms of supplying plenty of colour for summer. But really we ought to try and think about giving ourselves colour in spring, and believe it or not, even during the winter. And certainly with these very lovely winter flowering pansies that we can get these days, given mild conditions in the winter, they will happily give us a cheerful bit of colour, even in the dullest days. Here's a window box that I've prepared. I put some drainage material in the bottom. I filled it with compost, which I've lightly consolidated, and really we are ready then for planting. It's very nice, of course, even with a fairly ornate container, to cover up the edge, and what better in the winter than these rather nice ivies, especially, of course, the variegated types, which in themselves give a little bit of interest and colour. And by planting the edge first, it does give me some idea what space I've got left behind to fill in. The problem with a window box is, of course, it is long and narrow. And if you're not very careful, you can finish up with what we tend to call straight row planting. And that is not as good as doing more haphazard planting in behind. So, done my edge, and now's the time to infill. And you see, very good root system. That plant will get away extremely quickly. And I am not, you'll notice, going to plant all those yellows in a straight line. I'm going to put one into there. As I say, these have become extremely popular plants, and rightly so. Most of you will probably obtain what is called the universal strain, although there are other strains on the market. And I've got a red flowered one, or I suppose one would call it more a deep bronze, and quite hard sometimes to get out, but these have got plenty of root on, as you can see. Well, that's no bad thing. Bring that one more forward. And you'll see that I'm planting quite closely. As with all container planting, plant generously. Doesn't matter if plants have got to fight a little bit later on for their growing space, that will all help to fill out. I'm also going to include forget-me-nots. Sometimes you'll see them sold as, of course, myosotis, which is their proper name. I still very much like forget-me-nots, lovely bright blue, and again we can just fit them in fairly haphazardly. That's not to say without some thought of design, but it all helps to fill the planting area out, because the other thing we've got to think of in a minute, we're going to put some bulbs in as well. And I'm going to plant some tete-a-tete narcissus. It's a fairly dwarf growing cultivar, and quite clearly that's important not to have too high a planting when you've got a window box, because maybe in the spring you'll need to open your windows in any case, so not too high. And in any case, you want to have a planting that's in some sort of proportion. Tete-a-tete, very popular dwarf narcissus, and just simply scatter plant those through. Nice, clear, bright yellow. And that should look rather nice with the forget-me-nots. They're blue. I know the colour scheme's a bit hackneyed perhaps, but nonetheless, it still works extremely well. And don't be frightened to just generously plant those small bulbs. And we haven't finished yet, because believe it or not, I'm going to plant some muscari, some grape hyacinths, which again will flower just that bit earlier. And their nice clear blue flowers will of course complement the yellow pansies. And you'll see that I'm being extremely generous with the planting of the bulbs as well, which is a good thing. Can't overemphasize the business of planting tightly. Better to overplant than underplant. Nothing looks worse in a container than skimpy planting. A few more muscari. Don't be too worried as to where they go in. You'll find the overall scheme of things will be ideal. Window box ready for certainly spring and hopefully for winter too.
The contrast between flamboyant displays of colours and subdued displays of choice alpine or rock garden plants is very much a matter of personal choice and taste. The latter is more often the territory of the specialist gardener, but there is a place for them in the garden of any keen amateur. Old stone animal troughs have traditionally been used to grow alpine and other rock garden plants, but while they're always worth seeking out, they are scarce and expensive. This group can be grown in a pot or tub. However, there is a method which simulates the stone sink or trough that does the job just as well. Old ceramic kitchen sinks can be coated with a peat, sand and cement mix known as hypertufa. To make hypertufa, one needs a coarse and/or fine grit, ordinary builder's cement, sifted or sphagnum peat. A ceramic bonding cement is also essential for the operation. The flat-bottom sink will also have a drain hole, of course. It's a great asset and must be kept open at all times. See that the surfaces of the sink are clean and dry. It's advisable to roughen the surface with a glass cutter or masonry bit to aid bonding. Apply the ceramic cement thinly and evenly over the surface. The cement coating should be extended a short distance down the inner surface. To ensure good bonding of the hypertufa, the hardened cement surface is painted with Unibond. This operation is carried out one side at a time, so that the hypertufa is applied whilst the Unibond is still tacky. The hypertufa mix comprises 1 to 2 parts peat, 1 part sand and 1 part cement made into a thick paste, which is stiff, not runny. A standard sink will require about a 2-gallon bucket of hypertufa. The coating should be applied evenly to a thickness of 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. All the outer surfaces are covered, and it's important to spread over the inner rim of the sink, down to below what will be the finished soil level. By kneading the surface with one's hands, the overall appearance will result in a natural stone finish. The treatment will be dry within about a week. To further obtain a natural finish, the hypertufa is lightly scrubbed with a wire brush and finally painted with liquid manure or milk to encourage the growth of algae. A polystyrene box coated with Unibond and plastered with hypertufa in the same way can also be used. It's most important to make drainage holes in the base. It's possible to make a trough from scratch, which can be done by constructing two wooden box frames, one to fit inside the other, creating a cavity 2 to 3 inches between them. The surface of the boxes should be coated with oil to prevent sticking. It's additionally helpful to line the inner surface with newspaper. Pour 2 thin layers of hypertufa over the base of the larger box frame, placing mesh netting between the 2 layers and around the sides for strengthening. Press plastic tube or wood dowels right through the base to make drain holes. Put the smaller frame into position and then fill the cavity progressively with hypertufa, ensuring there are no air pockets and the side netting is obscured. For filling the cavities, a slightly runnier mix can be used, and it's helpful to gently tamp it in. Shape the rim of the trough to make it look as natural as possible. Cover the construction with polythene for about a week before carefully removing the box frames and drain formers. Here again, the final touch is to roughen and paint the surface as previously described. Sinks and troughs constructed in the way we've seen can mean a whole host of colourful alpines can be grown for a special interest and enjoyment. There is a wide choice of large custom-made containers for growing plants in courtyards or patios, and especially as features of focus in garden design. Terracotta pots are long established for this type of use, and they're quite suitable for keeping out of doors, providing they're frost-proof, which can be ensured by glazing. Some sorts of these pots have deep saucers to act as reservoirs, and all must have drainage holes. They come in plain versions or ornamented. These type of containers are usually relatively easy to move around, and they need to be respected as fragile. Heavy glaze pots come in a range of patterns. They're very stable and highly suitable for conservatory plants particularly. Wooden barrels and tubs provide a natural and sympathetic appearance. Even a humble plastic pot can be transformed with inspirational planting. It's cheap, durable, and more moisture retentive. Large ornamental containers are best suited for growing specimen plants of upright habit, which will complement rather than compete with the container. Concrete or reconstituted stone containers can be made into all manner of shapes, and after a period of weathering, it's difficult to differentiate them from the real stone ones. Whatever container the gardener chooses, and it is a personal choice, there are ground rules for sowing and planting that need to be followed.
Successful germination of seed has very much to do with choosing a good compost. Now, good seed compost should be well aerated, and it should also retain a certain amount of moisture. Now, lots of people still use a loam-based compost, and that's usually a John Innes seed compost, which can be quite easily obtained from Sundries Mint. Some people, of course, still much prefer to use what we generally term these days as a universal compost, and that comprises mainly of peat. And if folk don't want to use peat, then there are other composts based on coir, that's coconut fibre, or in some instances composted wood products. But these loam-based composts, the John Innes compost, can be made up at home. 2 parts of sterilised loam, 1 part of peat, 1 part of sand. That's by volume, by the way, to which you have to add superphosphate and a certain amount of chalk. But as I say, that's a bit of a fuss and bother, perhaps for many of you, and so the universal composts have it. Moisture content before preparing your container needs to be just firm enough when held in the hand to hold its shape. Slight touch, it parts easily. That's about the right condition before we start filling containers. Now, quite clearly, containers are important because it seems to me there's no point in having a container that is so large that you've got just a tiny amount of seed to sow in it. Waste of space, waste of compost. So it's very much horses for courses. Pots, perfectly good. Various sizes. Half pots, again, useful. Half trays. And in some instances where you're dealing with larger numbers of plants, quite clearly the full tray is the obvious choice. But for the purposes of sowing some tomato seed, I'm going to use a half tray, and I'm going to use loam-based compost that we've got prepared here. Fill the container just generously to the level of the brim, and then certainly with loam-based compost, do make sure that you firm all the way around and generally through the centre, making a nice level surface with a little firmer that one can easily make, a bit of flat wood, little handle on it. And then that does need to be soaked. 2 ways of doing it, either using a fine roast can, being very careful as you whisk it over the surface so that you don't make a lot of scarring, or you can dunk the container into a shallow tank, bucket, basin of water to make sure that the whole of the compost is well soaked. I'm going to use a container that I've already soaked. I'm going to sow the tomato seed. Now, there's various methods in which you can sow the seed. Some people prefer to shake it from the packet like that. Others to put it into the palm of the hand and then sow a pinch at a time. I still much prefer to just tap the side of the palm to allow the seed to come out, sowing as evenly as possible. The reason why I like this method is that I can tend to see the amount to be sown. I can see very clearly what I've got left to sow and gauge the spacing, I find anyway, much more easily. And I would suggest that's a very good sowing rate for seed of this size, bearing in mind that when the seeds germinate, the seed leaf, the cotyledon, is quite large, so this should give sufficient space for the germination to come through quite nicely. Now, covering seed. This again is a bit of a puzzle to some folk, and it has to be said that certain seed germinates much better if it's not covered with compost. Some examples: busy lizzies, impatiens, petunia, gloxinia, streptocarpus, all germinate much better if they're not covered down with actual compost. Having said that, I think if in doubt, always cover down. And again, there's a little bit of a rule of thumb, quite a dangerous thing often to talk about in gardening, but as a rule of thumb, cover down about 4 times the diameter of the seed. And again, some people much prefer to put compost through a fine sieve, If you can do that successfully, that's okay. Again, I much prefer to use the same size compost on which I've sown the seed, and with a little bit of practice I find that I can cover the seed that I've sown quite evenly. Now, because of the nice moisture content in that compost, as we've already described, there should be no need to soak up again that surface layer that you've put on. But if you are in any sort of doubt, then using a very fine roast can again, you'll be able to just soak that up nicely. Now, for fine seed, we do adopt a slightly different tactic. And very fine seed, a good example is begonia. About 2 million seed to the ounce, by the way. So it is very, very fine. Not the finest of all seed, of course. I'm going to use some very fine dry sand, shaking it up so that it's well mixed. And then we're ready for sowing in just the same way that we did the tomato. Just evenly spreading the sand seed mix. That will not need covering. If you feel that you need to put that in more contact with the moist soil, then again using a firmer, but do make sure that that surface is dry, because if not, then quite clearly lots of the seed and sand will adhere to the base of the firmer. And then going to very large seed, a good example is in fact runner bean. A lot of veg, incidentally, we can raise in our greenhouses. Runner beans, of course, good example. Just forward them just that little bit before we plant them out of doors. Just press them lightly into the filled units. They're going to germinate quite readily, so that when we come to plant them out, they will be easily lifted from their little pots. So there we are, 3 main methods of seed sowing for medium-sized seed, very fine and very large seed. Now, having sown our seed, we can either put them into a heated propagator, or we can put the container on a bench in a heated greenhouse, and for many, of course, a piece of glass over the top of the sown container, or maybe polythene, will suffice even on a windowsill.
Seed raising is an important method for starting flowering candidates for outdoor containers. A great many indoor container plants are propagated by vegetative propagation. Leaf cuttings can be taken from many foliage plants, such as the peperomias. An interesting and effective technique is to use the whole leaf, with veins on the underside cut to encourage plantlets, as is done with Begonia rex. Some other indoor container plants, like mother-in-law's tongue, can be suitably increased by carefully dividing the crown of the plant. Many others, like coleus, can be propagated by stem cuttings inserted into a gritty compost. Amongst others raised from cuttings are the popular chrysanthemums, which every autumn are admired by the thousands of visitors to Wisley. something we've come to expect from the great gardens of the country. Traditional containers holding traditional forms in a traditional setting. But today's gardener does not always have to stick to the ideas of yesteryear. Experimentation with form and shape can always be worthwhile. Indeed, traditionally, we've come to expect containers to be used for ornamentals, but where well managed, they're a useful means of growing fruit and vegetable crops and are a great asset where garden space is limited. One of the most worthwhile fruits grown in this way is the apple, on a dwarf rootstock and restricted by careful pruning. Columnar or pole tree forms are available, and there's the bonus of blossom in the spring. Pears and peaches are other top fruits which can be grown as single specimens in large containers. It's worth considering growing gooseberries and red and white currants by this method, because single plants of each can give a very useful yield of fruit, and all are suitable for restricted training techniques. A more specialised fruit is the vine, a well-established feature of British gardening, correctly thought of as vigorous and demanding of greenhouse space, but rarely as a candidate for containers. But this succulent fruit can in fact, with care, be grown in contained spaces.
And here we have a 5-year-old standard grapevine, which we keep pruned quite hard back each winter, so it makes new growths, and on those new growths we get our bunches of grapes. A vine of about this size will give you 5 to 6 bunches of grapes. We grow them usually in a loam-based compost, and of course for the conservatory, what better than have a nice ornamental container. Vines can be obtained quite easily from garden centres and 1 or 2 specialist nurseries, usually bought as 1 or perhaps 2-year-old plants. We then run them up on a stem, create a head, and here we have a very nice addition to any small greenhouse.
Courtyard and patio gardens need not be deprived of strawberries, which can be grown quite satisfactorily in large containers. The need here is to accommodate as many plants as possible onto the smallest floor area, and this can best be done by using specially made strawberry pots, which are available in clay or plastic form. Because the roots of plants in containers are restricted, it's essential that good drainage is provided. A suitable method is to put a good layer of large aggregate or pot crocks over the base. Like hanging baskets and window boxes, the planting compost should be of good consistency for drainage, which means that it will benefit from having a high proportion of grit incorporated into it. But multi-purpose soilless composts are quite suitable for most subjects and have the benefit of better moisture retention. Whilst containers should be filled firmly, they should not be compacted. Planting strawberries in containers should be done at the same time as for the outdoor crop, the late summer. Choose sturdy runners from healthy mother plants. The important thing is they should have well-developed roots.
We've planted as we filled the pot. There's one hole there to take that plant, and in this case I'm using 2 smaller plants. They'll be perfectly all right. In fact, will increase our fruiting. Now, we could have in fact used some of these nice plastic towers that are available for growing strawberries in. Wooden barrels are okay. Obviously you have to bore fairly large holes in the side, but that works very well. And what's not always appreciated, that after you've grown your tomato crop in the summer, we can take those plants out, just fluff up the compost and plant our strawberries into the old growing bag mixture, about 6 inches apart. The only trouble is, of course, that with a given square footage when you've got them in this vertical position, you get many more plants in a given space. And so we've topped off, and I've left a fair distance between the top of the rim and the compass so that we can get adequate water in. And I'm just going to fill out the space at the top. I've used just 3 plants here, but we could have in fact put in 5. And now for a thorough watering in, and this is very important to ensure that the compass gets thoroughly charged with water, not forgetting of course having watered the top to thoroughly soak the ones we planted in the side. And it will be noticed that this particular container has nice little lips just by the holes, and this does help to keep the water from spilling too much down the sides, and certainly is useful later on when we are going to be watering very regularly, and so all the way over. And once that's done, we should put the container out of doors, because it's very essential that it has a chilling. Obviously it would be better if we can keep it in somewhat of a sheltered place, but giving it the cool treatment is very essential for success later on with regard to fruiting.
For many, growing vegetables in large containers is a valuable option. They provide fresh produce near to hand, even for those with only a small patio garden. Very suitable crops are early roots, beans and salads. Even the mundane vegetable group can provide an attractive as well as worthwhile feature. Tomatoes are a popular crop, highly suited to container growing, not only in pots but in growing bags.
This plant is in an ideal condition for planting. The first truss has been well formed, and indeed flowers are just beginning to show colour. Root action is good. All I have to do now, just scoop out a hole and nestle the root ball into the compost, just slightly firmly with my fingers. Always be careful to remove side shoots. It's necessary to concentrate the strength into the main stem. I'm in fact planting 3 tomatoes into the growing bag, which is a fairly common recommendation. Having said that, many of you may find it's better to just grow 2, because great demands of course are made on both water and on feed, and you may find it more convenient just to have a couple of plants. There are 1 or 2 innovations which help with regard to watering. There's a polystyrene tray in which the bag is placed, tray filled with water. There's also pots which are specially constructed which insert into the top of the bag itself. But I cannot stress too much that having planted, we need to water in thoroughly. Also want to bear in mind too that we will want to leave 1 or 2 little holes at the base of the bag to help in initial drainage.
A miniature greenhouse environment can be created by the use of other types of containers, the glass bottle and terrarium. With thoughtful planning and management, these can provide a highly decorative feature for inside the home or conservatory. Containers come in 2 forms: the glass bottles, custom made with a wide neck, or second-hand carboys with a much narrower neck, and the terrarium, an ornamental container with a removable lid. The first important ingredient is a gritty compost free of fertilizer, then a coarse aggregate of gravel or clay pellets. Medium-grade horticultural charcoal is a special ingredient we'll explain later. Because of the depth of the bottles, different tools to plant and tend are required and can be easily made up by the indoor gardener. Then, of course, there is the selection of plants to be used. Slow-growing subjects with contrasting foliage, shapes and colours. The initial step of making your indoor garden is to cover the base of the bottle with a 1.5-inch layer of a coarse aggregate. It's easiest to do this with the aid of a paper funnel. Added next is a little horticultural charcoal to keep the growing medium sweet by absorbing gases and holding moisture. A shallow layer is provided over the top of the aggregate. Finally, in goes a 2 to 3 inch layer of compost into which a little charcoal has also been mixed. The compost should be moist but not wet when introduced to the bottle. And remember, it must be free of fertilizer to avoid luxuriant growth. The filled layer is then gently firmed, ready for planting. The best plan is to insert the largest plants first and to plant from the side of the container. Be sure that the plants chosen are healthy and free of pests. Tease out the compost from the root ball to encourage early establishment. Carefully introduce the plant to avoid damage. Plant firmly, ensuring the root ball is completely covered. Think of the operation as creating a diminutive landscape. Think all the time of the viewing angle. Is the container going to be on the floor or higher up on a table? Most garden centres offer a wide range of suitable species at a young stage of growth. Look out for ferns especially and other plants with interesting leaves. When planting is completed, lightly water the container by introducing just a trickle down the sides. The ornamental terrarium comes in various shapes and sizes and is a development of the valuable method of transporting plants used by 19th century plant collectors. Again, the same procedure is followed as for the glass bottle container. The factor of prime importance for both is to combine the plants in an interesting creation of colour and form. But of course, that creation is highly individualistic and offers scope for personal experimentation. An indoor landscape of your own making. To complete the environment, the terrarium lid is fitted carefully, or a stopper is used in the case of the glass bottle container. Large glass containers with narrow necks, such as carboys, offer their own challenges where a little ingenuity is called for. All the same techniques as used for terrariums and wide-neck containers come into play, but more patience and skill is called for. The reward is that the larger the container, the more dramatic can be the effect. All of these containers should be placed out of direct sunlight. Where well made, and there is a good balance, watering will only be necessary very occasionally. Where condensation appears, it's a sign that the contents are too wet. Clean the glass with a sponge and ventilate the container for a while. It's not just in glass containers that one can create artistic and dramatic displays. Interesting features can be made with some more unusual plants established and grown in pots. Cacti and succulents, for instance. The fascinating insect-eating plants. Orchids as well. There's a wide range of foliage or houseplants which can provide a constant display. Plants in containers, whether indoors or outside, demand most careful maintenance. Attention to watering is of the highest priority. Containers in full sun use up reserves more quickly and must be thoroughly watered daily. Indoor plants must be closely monitored for water needs. But remember, to overwater is just as potentially damaging. Regular feeding is essential to keep container plants healthy. Removing dead flowers and leaves is essential to keep plants in prime condition. Attention to these details will be rewarded in beautiful features to add colour and form to garden and home.
Regular maintenance is of paramount importance. Do remember to water thoroughly and regularly, feed regularly, and don't forget to take off those dead flower heads. These three things will ensure a long-lasting and certainly a beautiful display.